Liara Kestrel stared at her reflection in the polished surface of New Geneva's diplomatic tower, adjusting her formal attire one final time. The gleaming city-state floated 3 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean, a testament to humanity's resilience after the rising seas claimed much of Earth's coastal regions. The morning sun caught the iridescent panels that kept the city aloft, casting rainbow refractions across her face. Director Kestrel, her comlink chimed. The Meridian delegation has arrived. She took a deep breath, smoothing back her auburn hair. At 32, she was the youngest director of interspecies relations in the United Earth government's history. Today would either validate that appointment or destroy it entirely. Send them up, she replied, turning to face the hydrolock chamber where aquatic visitors could transition from their water-based environment to the air-filled human spaces. The chamber filled with a specialized breathing solution, and through the transparent walls, Liara watched as 3 figures emerged. Their bodies were humanoid but covered in iridescent scales that shifted between deep blue and violet. Gills lined their necks and their fingers were webbed. The leader of the group stood nearly 7 feet tall, his movements fluid and graceful despite the gravity difference. Ambassador Tavrin Knox, Liara greeted in perfect Meridian, her translator implant ensuring her pronunciation was flawless. Welcome to New Geneva. The ambassador's silver eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Director Kestrel, your reputation precedes you. As does yours, ambassador. She gestured toward the conference room. Shall we discuss the terms of our new cooperative initiative? The other 2 Meridians followed silently as Tavrin fell into step beside her. His scales rippled with what she recognized as amusement. You mean the forced partnership our governments have thrust upon us? Let's not dress it in diplomatic niceties. Liara maintained her professional smile. Direct as always, ambassador. Yes, let's discuss Project Confluence. The conference room's walls were lined with aquarium-like channels filled with oxygen-rich water, allowing Meridian visitors to submerge if they needed to refresh their breathing apparatus. Tavrin and his assistants remained in their atmospheric suits, however, a clear message that this would be a brief meeting. The terms are simple, Liara began, activating the holographic display. To foster better understanding between our species, key diplomatic personnel will be paired for extended periods of cooperation. Forced cohabitation, Tavrin interrupted, his gills flaring. Let's call it what it is. Your government and mine believe that by throwing us together like experimental subjects, we'll somehow bridge the gap between our peoples. Liara's smile tightened. Ambassador, if you have objections. My objections were noted and ignored by the Meridian Council, he said, his tone carrying a hint of bitterness. As I suspect yours were by your superiors. She paused, studying him. This was not how she'd expected the meeting to go. You're right, she admitted finally. I did object, not because I don't believe in cooperation between our species, but because forced intimacy rarely leads to genuine understanding. Something shifted in Tavrin's expression, surprise perhaps at her honesty. His scales settled into a deeper blue. Yet here we are. Here we are, she agreed. So we have 2 choices. We can treat this as a punishment and make each other miserable for the next 6 months, or we can approach it as an opportunity to prove both our governments wrong about how understanding is built. Tavrin's assistants exchanged glances, their scales flickering with rapid color changes that Liara couldn't quite interpret. The ambassador himself remained still, those silver eyes boring into her. You are not what I expected, Director Kestrel. Please, if we're going to be living together, call me Liara. She took a risk and stepped closer, nodding how his gills twitched at her proximity. And you're not what I expected either, Ambassador Knox. Tavrin, he corrected, and his scales shifted to a color she'd never seen before, a warm purple that seemed to glow from within. The next few hours were spent reviewing the practical aspects of their arrangement. Tavrin would split his time between the water-filled diplomatic quarters and Liara's residence, which was being fitted with specialized environmental controls. They would attend functions together, work on joint projects, and essentially become the face of human-Meridian cooperation. As their meeting concluded, Tavrin lingered while his assistants headed back to the hydrolock chamber. There's something you should know, he said, his voice lower than before. I chose this assignment. Liara blinked in surprise, but you said. I objected to the method, not the goal. His scales rippled with that strange purple again. Your work on the Deepwater Treaty last year caught my attention. You understand things that many humans don't about my people. I try to, she said carefully, wondering where this was going. Then perhaps this experiment isn't so flawed after all. He turned to leave, then paused. I'll see you tomorrow, Liara. I hope you're ready for what comes next. As she watched him glide away, Liara couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways no diplomatic training could have prepared her for. The next 6 months would either bridge an interstellar gap or create a diplomatic incident that would echo through history. Either way, she had a feeling sleep would be hard to come by tonight. She turned back to the window, watching the sun set over the endless ocean below. Somewhere down there in the depths humanity had barely explored lay the Meridian City's vast structures of living coral and ancient technology. Tomorrow she would begin learning their secrets, not through reports and transmissions, but through the eyes of one of their own. Well, she murmured to herself, at least it won't be boring. 2 weeks into their cohabitation experiment, Liara found herself swimming through one of New Geneva's underwater diplomatic sectors. The specialized breathing suit hugged her body like a second skin, its transparent helm giving her an unobstructed view of the magnificent architecture around her. Bioluminescent algae lined the corridors, creating patterns that pulsed with gentle blue light. Tavern moved through the water beside her with natural grace, his scales shimmering in the ethereal glow. Your swimming has improved, he noted, his voice coming clearly through their comlink. I had a good teacher, she replied, trying not to show how much concentration it took to maintain the proper form he'd taught her. Though I still feel like a clumsy surface dweller down here. You are a clumsy surface dweller, he said, but his scales flickered with that now familiar warm purple that she'd learned indicated amusement or affection. But you're learning. Their morning swim had become a ritual, one of many small compromises they'd worked out. She spent 2 hours each day in his aquatic environment, and he spent equal time in her air-filled quarters. It wasn't always comfortable for either of them, but that was rather the point. Something's troubling you, Liara observed, noting the deeper blue patterns rippling across his skin. She'd gotten better at reading his chromatic emotions, though many still eluded her. Tavern was quiet for a moment as they swam past a group of Meridian diplomats, who nodded respectfully but watched them with obvious curiosity. There have been irregularities in the communications between our deep city and the surface. What kind of irregularities? Messages delayed or lost entirely, security protocols randomly engaging, and, he hesitated, 3 of our environmental regulators failed yesterday. Liara stopped swimming, hovering in the water. That's serious, why wasn't I informed? Because officially, it's an internal matter. His gills flared with frustration. But unofficially, I'm concerned. These systems have redundancies upon redundancies, for 3 to fail simultaneously. Sabotage, Liara finished the thought. Her mind was already racing through the implications. Someone wants to disrupt communications between our peoples. Or worse, Tavern's scales had darkened to an almost black blue. The environmental regulators don't just maintain our comfort, Liara. They keep the crushing pressures of the deep ocean from collapsing our cities. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the water temperature. Do you trust me enough to show me the affected areas? His silver eyes studied her for a long moment. That's why I brought you down here, but we'll have to go deeper than you've ever been. The next hour was spent descending through increasingly pressurized zones. Liara's suit automatically adjusted, but she could feel the difference, a subtle weight pressing in from all sides. They passed through several security checkpoints, Tavern's presence allowing them through with minimal questioning. Finally, they reached vast chamber that seemed to be some kind of control center. Holographic displays showed real-time data from various systems throughout the Meridian City. Several technicians worked at different stations, their scales showing patterns of stress and concern that even Liara could recognize. Director Kestrel, a familiar voice called out. Liara turned to see Nadira Ven, one of Tavern's original assistants, swimming toward them. I didn't expect to see you in deep sectors. Nadira has been investigating the failures, Tavern explained, but Liara caught something odd in his tone. And what have you found? Liara asked, watching both meridians carefully. Nothing conclusive, Nadira's scales flickered rapidly, too rapidly for Liara to read, but the pattern suggests. An alarm suddenly blared through the chamber, its sound distorted by the water. Red lights pulsed along the walls, and the holographic displays flickered with warning symbols. Pressure variance in Sector 7, one of the technicians called out. Environmental regulators failing. Tavern moved with incredible speed, reaching a control panel in seconds. Reroute power from the auxiliary systems. Nadira, start evacuation procedures for that sector. But Nadira didn't move. Instead, she pressed something on her wrist device, and suddenly all the displays in the room went dark. "I'm sorry, Ambassador," Nadira said, her scales now a cold, stark white. "But the Meridian Alliance cannot continue this farce of cooperation with the surface dwellers." Liara's training kicked in. She noted the positions of everyone in the room, the exits, the way Nadira's hand was moving toward what looked like a weapon at her hip. But mostly, she watched Tavrin, whose scales had gone completely still, a reaction she'd never seen before. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Enough," Nadira replied. "The Pure Water movement has supporters throughout the deep cities. We will not allow our culture to be diluted by human influence." "By shutting down life support to hundreds of your own people," Liara interjected, anger overriding diplomacy. "That's not protecting your culture, that's terrorism." "You understand nothing of our ways," Nadira snapped, but Liara noticed her scales betraying uncertainty, flickers of green among the white. "Nadira," Tavrin's voice was calm, but his scales had begun to pulse with a deep red she'd never seen before. "Think about what you're doing. The treaty between our peoples isn't perfect, but it's keeping the peace. Without it, we can return to our true ways." Nadira drew her weapon, some kind of sonic disruptor. "The Council has grown weak, accepting human technology, human ideas. We need to." She never finished the sentence. Liara, who had been slowly adjusting her position in the water, activated her suit's emergency propulsion system. She slammed into Nadira just as Tavrin shouted a warning. The weapon discharged, sending a shockwave through the water that made Liara's teeth rattle even through her suit. What followed was chaos. The other technicians, some apparently loyal to Nadira, others to Tavrin, began fighting. In the water, combat was a three-dimensional dance of currents and trajectories. Liara's diplomatic training had included self-defense, but fighting underwater was entirely different. A sharp pain in her side told her the sonic blast had done some damage to her suit. Warning lights flashed inside her helm. The pressure seals were compromised. She had minutes at most before the crushing depths would become a very real problem. "Tavrin," she called out, trying to reach the control panel. "The regulators." He was already there, his webbed fingers flying over the controls. "Working on it, your suit." "Is failing, yes." She managed a smile despite the increasing pain. "Quite the second date, wouldn't you say?" His scales flickered with that warm purple again, even in the midst of crisis. "If you die, the paperwork will be astronomical." "Well, we can't have that." Together, they managed to restore power to the environmental systems and secure the control room. Nadira and her conspirators were contained, and Liara made it to a pressure-safe zone just as her suit gave out completely. Later in the medical bay, Tavrin visited her. "You took an enormous risk," he said without preamble. "Did I? Somehow I thought I was just doing my job." She winced as she sat up. "Besides, I couldn't let them destroy everything we've been working toward." "Oh, wait." "Yes, she met his silver gaze steadily. "Unless I've completely misread your chromatic patterns these past 2 weeks." His scales rippled with colors she was beginning to understand very well indeed. "Your interpretation has been accurate." "Good," she smiled, "because I think we're going to need to trust each other absolutely for what comes next. This wasn't an isolated incident, was it?" "No," he agreed grimly, "this was just the beginning." As if to emphasize his point, an alert chimed on both their comlinks, an urgent summons from their respective governments. The real test of their partnership was about to begin. The emergency council chamber buzzed with tension. Liara sat beside Tavrin, watching the holographic representatives of both governments argue back and forth. Her ribs still ached from the sonic blast, but she kept her posture perfect, refusing to show weakness. "The Pure Water movement must be crushed immediately," Admiral Jensen declared, his hologram towering over the assembly. "We cannot risk further attacks on critical infrastructure." "You speak of crushing our citizens as if they were insects," Elder Myra of the Meridian Council responded, her scales shimmering with barely contained anger. "These are our people, misguided though they may be." You're people who nearly caused a catastrophic breach in your own city, Jensen countered. Director Kestrel barely survived their actions. Liara felt Tavrin tense beside her, his scales darkening. She subtly moved her hand closer to his under the table, not quite touching but offering silent support. If I may speak, she said, drawing all eyes to her. The Pure Water Movement's actions are symptomatic of a deeper issue. They fear the loss of Meridian culture through integration with humanity. Meeting extremism with extremism will only validate their concerns. And what would you suggest instead? Elder Myra asked, her scales shifting to a curious shade of green. Let Ambassador Knox and I continue our work, Liara said firmly. But more openly, show both our peoples that cooperation doesn't mean erasure of identity. The debate raged for hours. Finally, a compromise was reached. The investigation into the Pure Water Movement would continue, but with joint human Meridian teams. The integration program would expand, not contract. As they left the chamber, Tavrin was unusually quiet. His scales had settled into a deep blue that Liara had never seen before. Your quarters or mine? She asked, trying to lighten the mood. Neither, he replied. There's somewhere else I need to show you. They took a private transport pod down to the deepest levels of the Meridian city. Here, the bioluminescent algae created patterns more complex than any Liara had seen before, telling stories in light and shadow. This is the memory chamber, Tavrin explained as they entered a vast circular room. Few surface dwellers have ever seen it. The walls were alive with moving images, scenes from Meridian history played out in shifting colors and patterns. Liara's breath caught as she watched a scene of ancient Meridians building their first underwater cities, their scales glowing with triumph and hope. Beautiful, she whispered. This is who we are, Tavrin said softly, not just diplomatically convenient allies but a people with our own history, our own ways. His scales rippled with emotion. The Pure Water Movement isn't entirely wrong about the risks of change. Liara turned to face him fully. Show me, she said, help me understand. For the next few hours, Tavrin guided her through Meridian history. He showed her the Great Migration, when rising temperatures forced his people to abandon their surface settlements. He showed her the development of the deep songs, a method of communication that carried for miles through water. Each story was more fascinating than the last. Your people are remarkable, she said finally. And you're right, this shouldn't be lost. But Tavrin, change doesn't have to mean destruction. Look. She pointed to where their reflections mingled in the crystalline walls, her human form and his meridian one, different yet somehow harmonious. We're not erasing who you are, she continued. We're adding to who we both can become. His scales shifted to that warm purple she'd grown so fond of, but there was something else there too, a shimmer of gold she'd never seen before. There's something else you should know, he said, his voice low. Nadira wasn't working alone. We've detected communications between pure water cells in all major Meridian cities. They're planning something bigger. Liara felt her diplomatic mask slip. How much bigger? They've acquired human antimatter technology. His scales went almost black with concern. One detonation at the right depth could trigger a chain reaction through the underwater currents, Liara finished, horror dawning. It would destroy every Meridian city on this side of the ocean. And create a tsunami that would devastate your floating cities. Tavrin's gills flared. They believe if they destroy the integration infrastructure, both our peoples will be forced back to their natural territories. Madness, Liara breathed. How long do we have? 3 days, maybe 4. We've tracked unusual energy signatures moving through the deep currents. But Liara, he paused, his scales showing conflict. This information comes from sources I'm not technically supposed to have. Sharing it with you could be seen as treason. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand against his scales. They were cool and smooth under her fingers, rippling with that mysterious gold color again. Thank you for trusting me, she said softly. I trust you more than my own counsel right now, he admitted, which is either evolution or madness. Maybe both, she smiled slightly. We need to stop them, but without causing the very conflict they're trying to provoke. Ideas. His scales flickered thoughtfully. A few, but we'll need help from both sides, people we can trust absolutely. I know some people in New Geneva's security force who owe me favors, Liara said. And you. I have contacts in the deep patrols who haven't bought into the pure water rhetoric. He touched her hand where it still rested against his scales. This won't be officially sanctioned if we're caught. Then we'll have managed to create an unprecedented diplomatic incident, she grinned. But if we succeed, we might just save both our peoples. Besides, I think we've moved beyond official sanctions, don't you? His scales rippled with that mix of purple and gold that made her heart beat faster. Indeed we have, Liara Kestrel, indeed we have. They spent the next hour planning in the memory chamber, surrounded by the history of his people while potentially writing a new chapter of their own. As they finally left, Liara caught their reflection again in the crystalline walls. Something had changed, subtle but undeniable. They moved in sync now, anticipating each other's movements, reading each other's smallest signals. Tomorrow then, she said as they reached the transport pod. Tomorrow, he agreed. Rest well, Liara, I have a feeling we'll need all our strength for what's coming. As she watched him glide away, his scales still shimmering with that mysterious new gold, Liara realized that somewhere between diplomatic necessity and crisis, between cultural exchange and shared danger, she'd developed feelings that no amount of professional training had prepared her for. And based on those gold ripples in his scales, a color she'd never seen him display for anyone else, she wasn't the only one. The deep currents were darker than usual, thought Liara, as she followed Tavrin through a maintenance tunnel far below the official Meridian City levels. Their small team, 3 trusted humans and 4 loyal Meridians, moved silently through the water. Energy signatures are stronger here, whispered Rylan, one of Tavrin's deep patrol contacts, his scales pulsing with faint bioluminescence to help them navigate. The pure water zealots must be close. Liara checked her specialized stealth suit's readings. They had maybe 2 hours of air left at this depth. 2 hours to find the antimatter device and prevent catastrophe. Movement ahead, came Jade's voice through the comm system. The human security officer had been Liara's friend since academy days. Large chamber, multiple heat signatures. Tavrin's scales flickered with a brief pattern, a private message for Liara that meant be ready. She'd gotten surprisingly good at reading his chromatic language over the past months. They found the pure water movement's hidden base inside a massive ancient coral structure. Through the gaps in the fossilized walls, Liara counted at least 20 figures moving around what could only be the antimatter device, a sinister black sphere trailing cables into the coral. By the deep currents, Rylan breathed. They've modified it. That's not just a bomb, they're using the coral's natural channels to amplify the blast wave. Can we disarm it? Jade asked. Not without triggering failsafes, Tavrin replied, his scales dark with concern, but we might be able to contain it. Liara understood immediately. The coral, if we can collapse the right sections. We can direct the blast into the abyssal trench, Tavrin finished, but we'll need a distraction. What happened next was chaos. Their team split half, creating a diversion by flooding several chambers with bioluminescent smoke, while the others planted charges at key structural points in the coral. Liara found herself face to face with the Pure Water Movement's leader, a scarred Meridian elder whose scales were permanently bleached white. You dare defile our sacred spaces with your surface dweller presence. Your sacred spaces, Liara shot back, dodging a blast from his sonic weapon. You're the one planning to destroy your own cities. Better destruction than dilution, he fired again, catching her suit's shoulder plate. Warning lights flashed in her helm. Suddenly Tavrin was there, his scales blazing with a fierce red she'd never seen before. The fight between them was like watching 2 currents collide, beautiful and terrible. You're no true Meridian, the elder spat, consorting with surface filth, betraying our ways. Our ways, Tavrin's voice was cold. Our ancestors built these cities to save our people. They welcomed change when it meant survival. You're the one betraying their legacy. The charges were set. Jade's voice crackled through the comm. 30 seconds. Liara saw the elder reach for something, a detonator. She moved without thinking, propelling herself through the water. Her suit's propulsion gave out just as she slammed into him, sending the device spinning away into the darkness. The next few moments were a blur, the charges detonating, the coral structure groaning, Tavrin's scales flashing urgent patterns as he pulled her clear. The antimatter device sliding into the trench, its containment field finally failing just as it passed the point of no return. The blast was spectacular but contained, sending shock waves they felt even through their suits. When it was over, the Pure Water Movement's leaders were in custody, their followers scattered. Hours later, in a secure medical bay, Liara watched the news broadcast with Tavrin. Their unauthorized mission had become public knowledge, causing political upheaval in both governments. "They're calling it the deep current crisis," she said, wincing as a medic treated her shoulder. "Though I noticed they're focusing more on the prevented disaster than how we broke about 15 diplomatic protocols." 17, Tavrin corrected, his scales showing that familiar purple amusement. "Though who's counting?" "Apparently you are," she smiled, then grew serious. "What happens now?" Now, his scales shifted through several colors before settling on that gold that made her heart race. "Now we face the councils together. They can hardly deny the success of human meridian cooperation after this." "Success that nearly got us killed," she pointed out. "Success that proved what we've been saying all along." He moved closer, his scales rippling with intensity. "Our peoples are stronger together than apart." The medic tactfully withdrew, leaving them alone. Liara was acutely aware of how close Tavrin was, how his scales seemed to shimmer just for her. "You know," she said softly, "I never did get to finish learning all your chromatic patterns." "No," his hand found hers. "Perhaps we should continue those lessons, for diplomatic purposes, of course." "Of course," she squeezed his hand, "though we might want to wait until after we face the council's judgment." Agreed, but he didn't move away. "Liara, that gold you've been seeing in my scales." "Oh yes, it's only ever appeared around you." Before she could respond, their comlinks chimed simultaneously. The councils were ready for them. But as they headed to face whatever consequences awaited, Liara noticed her reflection in a window. She was glowing, almost as if she had scales of her own. Perhaps some changes, she thought, were worth every risk. 1 year after the deep current crisis, New Geneva's diplomatic tower had been transformed. The entire structure now alternated between aquatic and air-breathing environments, a physical manifestation of the changes sweeping through both societies. Liara stood in one of the transition chambers, watching the water level rise around her. She no longer needed a suit for these transitions. The bioengineered gill implants along her neck took care of that. They were the first successful human-meridian medical collaboration, a direct result of the crisis that had nearly torn their peoples apart. Lost in thought, Tavrin's voice came clearly through the water as he entered from the aquatic side. His scales were dancing with familiar patterns, purple, gold, and now a new silver that had started appearing recently. "Remembering," she replied, feeling her gills activate as the chamber filled completely. "Hard to believe it's been a year." "A year since you nearly got yourself killed saving both our peoples." His scales flickered teasingly. "Or a year since you finally admitted you could read my chromatic patterns better than most meridians." "Both," she smiled, moving through the water with practiced ease. "Though I'm still learning new ones, that silver, for instance." Ah, his scales rippled with what might have been embarrassment. Well, perhaps we should discuss it after the ceremony." The ceremony? Liara felt her heart speed up slightly. Today, the first group of human meridian pairs would graduate from the new voluntary integration program, one that she and Tavrin had helped design after the crisis. No more forced partnerships, no more cold diplomatic arrangements. Instead, they'd created a system of cultural exchange based on mutual interest and respect. "Nervous?" Tavrin asked as they made their way to the grand chamber. "About the ceremony? No," she gave him a knowing look. "About whatever has your scales turning silver, maybe a little." The grand chamber was packed with representatives from both species. The graduating pairs, 15 in total, stood proudly together, each showing signs of adaptation to their partner's environment. Humans with gill implants, meridians with enhanced atmospheric tolerance. But more importantly, each pair showed signs of genuine connection. As the senior diplomatic pair, Liara and Tavrin were expected to speak first. They moved to the center platform, the water around them charged with anticipation. "A year ago," Liara began, her voice carrying clearly through the water, "many believed our peoples were too different to truly understand each other. That the best we could hope for was cold cooperation. We proved them wrong," Tavrin continued, his scales glowing warmly. "Not through force or political maneuvering, but through something far more powerful, genuine connection. Each pair before you today has found their own path," Liara gestured to the graduates. "Their own way of bridging our differences while celebrating them." "And they are just the beginning," Tavrin added, "which brings us to an announcement." This wasn't part of the planned ceremony. Liara turned to him, curious, as his scales began to shimmer with that mysterious silver again. The council has approved a new initiative, he said, but he was looking only at her now. A deeper integration program for those who wish to make their partnerships permanent. Liara's heart seemed to stop. Permanent. His scales were a cascade of silver and gold now. The medical teams have confirmed it's possible, a complete biological adaptation that would let partners share both environments permanently. But it would be irreversible, a true joining of our peoples. The chamber was absolutely silent. Liara was acutely aware of every eye on them, but she couldn't look away from Tavrin. And you're announcing this now because... Because, his voice softened, I would like to be the first to volunteer, with you if you're willing. The water around them seemed to pulse with energy. Liara was aware of the political implications, the historical significance of this moment. But all she could think about was the way his scales shimmered, the way her heart raced, the way they'd moved from diplomatic necessity to something so much more profound. The silver in your scales, she said slowly. It means hope, doesn't it? Hope for something permanent. Yes, he held out his hand to her. What do you say, Director Kestrel, ready for one more evolution? Liara took his hand, feeling the smooth scales against her palm. Well, Ambassador Knox, I did say I wanted to learn all your chromatic patterns. Their laughter rippled through the water, joined by cheers from the assembled crowd. As Tavrin pulled her close, his scales blazing with joy, Liara caught their reflection in the chamber's crystalline walls. They were both glowing now, their separate lights combining into something new and beautiful. Later that evening, they stood in their favorite spot in the memory chamber, watching the historical scenes play out around them. But now there were new scenes too, their story, their crisis, their triumph. You know, Liara said, when they first assigned us to be diplomatic partners, I thought it was the worst idea in history. Really? Tavrin's scales danced with amusement. I thought it was the second worst. The worst was falling in love with a surface dweller. Terrible idea, she agreed, leaning against him. Almost as bad as falling in love with a meridian. Almost? His scales rippled with all their special colors, purple for affection, gold for love, and silver for their shared future. But I think we made it work. Above them, the floating cities of New Geneva glittered like stars. Below, the deep currents carried songs between meridian communities. And here, in between, they had found something extraordinary, a love that transcended species, a partnership that had changed two worlds. Yes, Liara said softly, watching their lights merge and dance in the crystalline walls. We made it work beautifully.